morning and welcome to Rising. We've got another great show for you today. It is Wednesday and we switched the table around, the better to see you with, my friend.
Absolutely. We're at a perfect angle to each other. Neither straight on, but not exactly side by side either. We'll see how it goes.
It's going to massively enhance our commentary for sure. Let's get right to it. Vice President Kamala Harris is continuing her media blitzkrieg. First stop on Tuesday was the Howard Stern show. What did we learn? Well, not much, other than she likes Doritos, Formula One, and also Prince, the artist formerly known as. On a more serious note, she discussed the death threats that she's received throughout her career. She says she, however, refuses to live in fear.
So when you went after gang members, I'm talking about people who traffic drugs and this and that kind of thing. Were you ever directly threatened by these people? They said, hey, you better just shut this down or you're going to get it?
I've definitely had death threats.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't generally talk about them, but yes.
Why don't you talk about them? Because you don't want to encourage any kind of nuts out there, or is it because it's just too hard to confront?
I refuse to live in fear of the bad guy.
She also touted her career as a prosecutor.
To me, you're the law and order candidate, and yet they try to paint you like you're some leftist who I don't know, who wants to have people running through the streets committing crimes. You were a prosecutor.
I have put a lot of people in jail. I have personally prosecuted everything from, child sexual assault to homicides. And
Harris also made the claim that Trump is getting played by dictators.
Doesn't support our friend Ukraine. Doesn't support, therefore, something America should always, and has always, by the way, been a champion of, which is the importance of sovereignty and territorial integrity, which means the importance of standing against anyone who tries to take another nation by force. You're getting played, and some would say, look, I grew up in the neighborhood. Some would say you're getting punked.
Yeah.
If you stand in favor of somebody who's an adversary over your friends on principles that we all agree on. And you look at it, it's not only that. He says he's going to be a dictator on day one. Understand what dictators do. They jail journalists. They put people who are protesting in the street in jail.
To end her day, Harris also sat down with late night host Stephen Colbert, where the two shared her favorite beer.
Would you like to have a beer with me so I can tell people what that's like? Okay, this was... Now, we asked ahead of time because I can't just be giving a drink to the Vice President of the United States without asking. You asked for Miller High Life. You asked for Miller High Life. I'm just curious.
Okay, the last time I had beer was at a baseball game with Doug.
So cheers.
Cheers.
Some really hard-hitting interviews there. And look, I don't begrudge her for doing friendly media interviews. It's fine to do friendly media. The American people do want to see a little bit of personality, come to better understand the people running for office. That's fine. It should be in addition to hard-hitting, adversarial, confrontational interviews with major networks, and that's the part she doesn't do. So it's not that I'm mad she's doing this, but it's all she does. Is that fair?
The exception to it is the 60 Minutes interview, which she did do, and in my opinion didn't fare especially well in, to say.
No wonder she only wants to be on with Howard Stern and The View.
Right, so I mean, she's now doing these much softer interviews, which are much friendlier, and even then they're not completely free of peril for her, because it was on The View that she was asked, are you going to do anything different from Biden? And she said she couldn't think of a thing that she was going to do differently. And then the Trump campaign and Republicans seized on that, given Biden's low approval numbers. In relation to 60 Minutes, I do think it's to her credit that she agreed to do that one. Like I say, I don't think it was particularly great. And it got back to that problem that even people on the left often have with Kamala Harris, of the authenticity question. She was asked about her changes in position. She meandered into this answer about how she's travelled the country and listened to people and they want compromise. Not massively persuasive. Having said that, she did 60 Minutes. Trump, of course, declined to do 60 Minutes.
Colbert asked her almost a version of the question that she got about, what would you have done differently, where he asked, how can you be the change candidate? Americans want a change, but you're part of the past administration. I think she has really struggled to come up with a satisfying answer to this. If I were her, I would try to say, well, they want they want what they were promised, but we were unable to deliver it because we're thwarted by Republicans, so you need to vote for more Democrats, and then we can deliver. I don't agree with that, but if that's her, that's what I would say. Additionally, the Howard Stern interview in particular, man, has this guy changed a lot over the years into a just incredibly, I would say, simple thinking partisan Democrat, trying to fangirl her as the candidate of law enforcement, which I think speaks to just the weird turn she took in the 2018-2019 period, where she did really try to do a 180 on her more authentic self. Because I agree, she was a prosecutor. She was tough on crime, in some ways tougher on crime than I would like her to be on certain categories of crime, including truancy. And then she utterly, and I would argue insincerely, betrayed that version of herself to fit this what elites thought was the current moment of defund the police and Black Lives Matter and everything, a elite movement that never had the level of deep public support that so many in progressive media pretended it did, and she was forced to adapt all these stances that ended up being very unpopular. Her campaign went nowhere, and now she's undone all of that.
Yeah, so without relitigating 2020, I wonder, was it the stances that were unpopular, or was it the sense that she genuinely didn't believe one thing or another?
Yeah.
Because
both.
We did see figures on the left do fairly well. I mean, Bernie Sanders did pretty well in that primary, not as well as he'd done in 2016, but pretty well. I do think the issue of authenticity, as I say, really does, I mean, that's a big problem for Harris, I think. And when there is these polls that say people need to know her better, I think part of what they need to know is, does she have sincere beliefs? Now, just to that point, it was interesting to me in the Colbert interview, she said, the question of what she would do differently, she said, well, I'm not Joe Biden and I'm not Donald Trump. That's fine, maybe. I mean, that seems her entire campaign to some extent, right? I'm younger and more vibrant than Biden, and I'm not Donald Trump. That might actually be enough to win. It's just not an especially inspiring message.
It might be enough because the candidates are, in fact, so old. I mean, she's running to replace a man who we have serious questions there's no way he could serve another term. I have questions about whether he can even be the president right now as the world is on fire, as things are falling apart in the Middle East. What is the current administration doing to try to find a peaceful solution between Israel and Lebanon and Iran and everything? Do we have someone who can be roused from nap time? We don't even know. It's very concerning. So that's a good pitch over Joe Biden. And of course, Donald Trump is advanced in age as well. I would argue he's not betrayed the exact same sort of, nearly the same sort of decline over time. Obviously, many people think the things he says have always been disconnected from reality, but I don't think there's been a dramatic change that we've witnessed. So if you liked him and thought policies were good and he was good at running the country before, I don't think you're watching him and saying, well, now he's not cut out for it anymore to the same extent as Biden.
But in fairness, I think that isn't the primary objection to Trump. I mean, some people on the left do make the cognitive argument, but
they started making it when Biden was done.
That's right.
Couldn't make it then. And then the day after, they're like, well, this guy's pretty old for this job, isn't he?
And you and I actually agree that was opportunistic and completely sort of selective in the way the logic was applied there. But look, the argument against Trump is, firstly, he's unhinged, and secondly, he's an active danger to American democracy. And thirdly, and here's where the softer Harris interviews I think did work for her, she makes the argument that his inherent sort of selfishness or narcissism makes him ill-placed to actually solve people's problems. And I suspect that might be actually a more effective argument to whatever sliver of voters are still in the middle ground.
Well, did Kamala Harris pass the I'd like to have a beer with this person test? You tell us. We'll have more Rising right after this. Niall, what's in your notes today?
So Israel could strike Iran at any moment. The Biden administration had hoped to learn more about Benjamin Netanyahu's plans today. But a scheduled trip to Washington by Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant was cancelled at the last minute at Netanyahu's behest. Just one more example of the Israeli Prime Minister's disdain for his sponsors in the White House and at the Pentagon. Netanyahu, like Gallant, stands accused of war crimes by the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court. And that's worth emphasising, even in a week when we mark the atrocious Hamas attacks of last year. America's selective focus on Israeli suffering has too often blinded us to the suffering of the Palestinians, and now to the Lebanese as well. 1 year on, atrocities ignored, brutalities excused, war crimes denied. But this catastrophe is not Israeli-made alone. It has been facilitated by a president of the Democratic Party, a president who talks of human rights while enabling terrible wrongs. The Secretary General of Doctors Without Borders, Chris Lockyer, puts it this way, quote, "For 1 year, Israel's allies have continued to provide their military support to Israel as children are killed en masse, tanks fire on deconflicted shelters, and fighter jets bomb so-called humanitarian zones." Last week, almost 100 American physicians who have volunteered in Gaza over the past year wrote an open letter to Biden and Harris. They wrote, quote, "Every one of us who worked in an emergency, intensive care, or surgical setting treated preteen children who were shot in the head or chest on a regular or even daily basis." In a supporting document, the physicians noted, quote, "The rate of killing of children in Gaza since October 7th is 293 times higher than in Ukraine in 2022. Children don't get shot in the head every day by accident. And what have Biden or Harris done in response? He paused an arms shipment, just the one, and that's paltry when you consider that the United States has spent a record $17.9 billion at least on military aid to Israel over the past year. That's according to a new report from Brown University. Harris has sometimes sounded a bit more sympathetic to Palestinian suffering, but policy changes, there's not much sign of those. She has ruled out suspending arms shipments to Israel. And with Lebanon now aflame, she issued a statement a few days back, noting that the US will provide assistance with, quote, "essential needs, such as food, shelter, and water." But this is Biden redux from Harris, seeking credit for providing aid to suffering people with one hand, but accepting no responsibility for shoveling bombs to the military that is killing them with the other. Now, my point is not to suggest that Donald Trump would be any better for the Palestinians or Lebanese than Harris or Biden. He would almost certainly be worse. But one of the most ignominious features of the past year has been the willingness of liberal politicians and pundits to mute their criticism of a catastrophe, simply because the president enabling it is a Democrat and the nation in question is Israel. If a Republican president had embraced a hard-right foreign leader through a year-long slaughter, that president would rightly be excoriated. How about a Republican president that said, yes, but our support helps us influence our foreign ally to let in more humanitarian aid? CNN and MSNBC and the New York Times would remind us, rightly, that this effort had yielded such dismal results that the US had to build a floating pier off the Gaza coast. A pier, that is, that cost American taxpayers $320 million and promptly fell apart. How about if our hypothetical Republican president had said, yes, but our closeness to this foreign power, it's helped prevent a wider war. And even while those words were echoing, the foreign power in question attacked an Iranian consulate in Syria, assassinated an adversary in Tehran, bombed Beirut, and invaded Lebanon. Let's not kid ourselves or let the shadow of a possible second Trump presidency block out the reality that's right in front of our faces. What Biden and Harris and Tony Blinken and Jake Sullivan call a strategy on the Middle East has collapsed, and all that's left is a sludge of political and moral incoherence. Can Kamala Harris find a way out? Does she even want to try? If she doesn't, the verdict of history will be damning. But history's verdict can be a long time coming. Too late for the people who die for the mistakes of presidents, or of vice presidents, for that matter.
I think it's very important to point out what you just did, which is that the difference between Biden and Harris on the policy here is just vibes. It's just something people hoped for. It's not materializing. And you're right to say, maybe she sounds a little bit more sympathetic, but that is just words. She has said that she would do nothing differently. I don't know that Trump would do anything differently. You say it would be worse. I don't know, because he doesn't speak very much about this policy. But no one, Democrat or Republican side, is going to give progressives what they want on this, is what it sounds like to me.
No, I think that's right. And I think progressives are not in as much of a minority on this issue as they are on some others. Certainly within the Democratic Party, I think what you see is a disconnect between elected officials who are broadly, with the exception of the squad, more pro-Israel, and within the Democratic voter base, a very different view where the plurality of Democratic voters in the overall conflict are more sympathetic to the Palestinians. To the point of Harris, I do think that it is important for progressives to put pressure on her, because so far they have been kind of satisfied with vibes, as you put it, with this sense of like, oh, well, she's maybe tonally a bit different. Tones don't save anybody in Gaza or Lebanon or anywhere else.
Right, and Biden got Genocide Joe chance, and she's not getting any of that, even though she's part of the existing administration. She's co-signed the policy, and she's not going to do anything differently. I mean, I can actually imagine her being even more pro-Israel than Biden is. In some ways, she has closer ties. Her husband is Jewish. She spoke at Israel's 71 of their anniversary parties, and so on. Now, she said she doesn't, like Netanyahu, but Biden privately, now that we know from Woodward's book, did you see those highlights yesterday? That in private, he's swearing and screaming about Netanyahu, but then, of course, is not changing anything about the policy.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, I did read those Woodward excerpts with interest, but one of the problems that I have is that we constantly get told just how annoyed Biden is with Netanyahu, but beyond pausing that one arms shipment, he never does anything about it. Would Harris do anything more? That seems unlikely. I do think Trump would be worse because, when he was president, he moved the embassy. There was like a peace plan that was very, very pro-Israel. His objection, though, seems to be that what has happened in Gaza is sort of bad PR for Israel, which is a very Trumpian way to look at it and not really the point. But yes, I do think that Harris has real questions to answer here.
And these policies are unusual from the U.S. standpoint, because past administrations, past U.S. presidents, Republican and Democrat, Reagan, George H.W. Bush, did come to points with Israeli leadership where they said, this is going too far and we're now worried for our security, and you've responded to an attack, and that was legitimate to do so, but you cannot unilaterally involve us in World War III. Biden uniquely has not taken that action where past presidents in both parties, who were strong supporters of Israel, did.
Yeah,
and that's what's so notable.
No, and I think that's a really important point, because look, the whole issue is, are American interests being served by what's going on right now? I would argue that firstly, there's a vast cost, but there's also an isolation of the United States on the world stage, because it's not, whether one defines oneself as pro-Israel or not, the absolutely staunch backing and the impunity that Biden has lended to Netanyahu, I think, is very dangerous for the United States.
We'll be back with more Rising right after this.
Kamala Harris and Donald Trump are neck and neck in the critical border state of Arizona. Harris is heading there today again. A pair of recent polls show the two candidates polling within the margin of error, but each poll shows a slightly different outcome. A new Emerson College polling Real Clear World survey reveals Trump topping Harris by 3 percentage points, with 50% to 47 among likely voters. A second survey, led by the television station Arizona's Family and the Arizona public affairs firm High Ground, found Harris in the lead, with 48% of support among likely voters in the state, compared to Trump's 46%.
According, the Latino vote has been key in Arizona, where 1 in 4 voters there identify as Latino. Democrats have traditionally counted on this voting bloc, but if we can take anything away from recent polling, it's that Harris has work to do to win over more Latinos, specifically male Latinos. According to a recent USA Today Suffolk University survey, the GOP nominee is leading among male Latino voters ages 18 to 34, with 51% compared to Harris's 33%. Now, among 35 to 49-year-olds, Trump is polling 57% compared to Harris's 37%. There's also, in Arizona, a critical Senate race between the GOP nominee, Kari and Ruben Gallego. Here to break this all down is Camaron Stevenson, the founding editor and chief political correspondent at the Cooper Courier. He is based in Phoenix. Welcome to Rising.
Hey, yeah, thanks for having me.
Yes, good to have you on. Arizona is, of course, one of the critical swing states, also a state with a kind of independent and maverick sensibility among the voters. Arizona has sent John McCain and Kyrsten Sinema to the Senate. What are you looking out for this election cycle?
Yeah, no, Arizona is known for picking their own kind of people. Our voters here are very much interested in who the candidate is, what they stand for, and how they're going to deliver for Arizona. And so we're seeing that in two very interesting ways with the Senate race and the presidential race. The polling is very different. Ruben Gallego has a fairly comfortable lead on Kari Lake, the Republican candidate, if you're to take the polling into account. Whereas, as you just talked about, the polling between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris is fairly neck and neck. And a lot of that has to do with, one, Trump has a strong history here. Although he lost in 2020, he has had a strong and confident base that has maintained through the years. Whereas Kari Lake has made some major missteps in her campaign, both as running for Senate and while she was running for governor in 2022, that has kind of burned a lot of that goodwill that you would think would go her way and immediately cause people to vote for Trump and Lake. Whereas what we're seeing is there's a definite split there where people are kind of tired of what she's doing, the way that she's campaigning, and they're very much warming up to Ruben Gallego, who before this was a somewhat smaller, lesser known member of the House of Representatives.
I just want to jump in there, Camaron, because it is interesting, the disconnect that you mentioned between the presidential race and the Senate race. And I guess we're accustomed to the idea of the top of the ticket perhaps affecting the races lower down the ticket. But certainly there was some reporting, and I heard sort of whisperings within the Trump camp that at one point they were worried about Kari Lake, who is very controversial, kind of dragging his chances down in Arizona. But it doesn't seem like, from what you say, that's really a plausible scenario at this point.
I would be surprised, and only because Donald Trump as a figure he's his own person. He is very much an independent entity. He came into the Republican Party and took it over, reshaped it in his image. And anything under that, I have a hard time seeing that leading to a drop in support for him. Similar to North Carolina, as far as I know, what's going on with the gubernatorial race is not affecting Donald Trump. Whereas Kari Lake, when she ran for governor, it was a close race, but then she spent the next several years litigating that race. She's actually still in court battles trying to unseat the current governor and have her seated as governor. And that's very off-putting to people for a lot of reasons. One, there's a lot of respect for people who lose and, take their licks and move on. Whereas she is still fighting for that seat while she's running for the United States Senate.
Immigration, border security is one of the biggest issues, if not the biggest issue in this election nationally. Arizona is, of course, a very key border state. How are the candidates addressing that issue? How is their messaging resonating? And, in an election cycle where Republicans have a decisive advantage, according to polling, on this issue, what is Ruben Gallego doing specifically that is so successful to be ahead of Kari Lake, even though this is the most important issue and polls show favorable conditions for Republicans on it?
Yeah, I think Ruben Gallego actually has a lot going for him in that respect. One, he has been a public servant for years and years. Before he was in the House of Representatives, he was in the state legislature. Before that, he was in the military, served in Afghanistan, and saw horrific losses of his battalion. And so he has been able to, he knows how the mechanisms of government work. And so he is able to talk about his record, about how he's voted in the House. He voted to support this bipartisan border bill that, Donald Trump opposed, Kari Lake opposed. And when he visits and talks with people and goes to the border, it feels more authentic to people, more than just a photo op, because he has those experiences and because he has that background to fall back on. He also has the benefit of being able to speak directly to voters who are concerned about immigration, both citizens and immigrants. He is a fluent Spanish speaker. He is able to talk to people at their doors about these issues, talk to people who may be afraid of immigration in a way that humanizes what is actually going on at the border, which is more of a humanitarian crisis than anything. I think a lot of the rhetoric that Kari Lake espouses also kind of jumps the shark. You can say millions of people are crossing the border and coming into Arizona only so many times before you look around and there's no evidence of that. People are coming into the United States, of course, but not in the numbers that they're saying. Not in this sheer, almost absurd magnitude that they're trying to portray.
Camaron, just on a separate topic, the issue of election legitimacy and false claims that can get put back and forth about elections being fraudulent and all of that. To the best of my knowledge, and please correct me if I'm wrong, Kari Lake has never accepted her defeat in the gubernatorial election in 2022. And obviously Arizona in the presidential election in 2020 was decided by a very, very narrow margin. Do we see people stoking suspicion or doubt about the legitimacy of the forthcoming election? Is that a concern? What's your read on that?
Yeah, so unfortunately, there is a segment of the population of voters who are suspicious and skeptical of our election systems because so many lies and mistruths have been disseminated by people like Kari Lake and especially Donald Trump with the big lie in his 2020 election. So there is a segment of people who will believe that no matter what. But I think a larger portion of voters see our election systems as safe and secure. They see this really interesting thing in Arizona where the people who run our elections, several times they have lost their election, which doesn't make sense if you're trying to rig an election. The first one you're probably going to look out for is your own. And so people see things like that. They see the process playing out as it should. And then they see these court battles where, if there is illegitimacy in elections, that's where it gets hashed out. That's where we can figure out if something is going on, if there's something wrong. And the courts in every instance have found that our elections are free and fair. In the handful of times where there has been any fraudulent activity, and by handful I mean this would affect less than 100 votes. Those people have been found, they've been prosecuted, and they have been held to account according to the law. So there is going to be unrest, and that's just the nature of Arizona elections at this point, because there is that base of people who are so skeptical, and because of the way that we conduct elections, it takes time for us to count all of our votes and get all of those results. And in that time, people are able to kind of sow that confusion. But by and large, people are pretty confident.
Camaron, thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
America's second gentleman and supposed wife guy, Doug Emhoff, could be further tainted. A new report in the Daily Mail claims that Emhoff was inappropriate and also misogynistic during his tenure as the head of the law firm Venable in Los Angeles.
Josh Boswell said at a 2019 lawsuit alleging Emhoff presided over sex discrimination by other partners. The plaintiff, Marjan Rabai, alleges enduring, humiliating and demeaning comments from two partners at Venable. According to court documents, Emhoff allegedly, quote, hired an unqualified part-time model as a legal secretary, quote, because she was young, attractive and friendly with the powerful men in the office. It should be noted Emhoff was not a defendant in the claim, but he was cited in the complaint that Rabai filed. This latest allegation is part of a string of questionable incidents that might upend Emhoff's pro-feminist image that he and the Harris campaign have clung onto. Adding to this revelation, the Daily Mail also reported on a 2012 incident that alleges Emhoff struck an ex-girlfriend in the face, and he cheated on his former wife with the nanny 4 years prior in 2008.
So look, I'm not going to make a mountain out of this latest story in the Daily Mail, workplace gripes from a long time ago that we can't really litigate ourselves.
And anonymous sources often.
Anonymous sources that don't even specifically involve his conduct. is not nearly enough for me to form some new or different impression of him. He isn't even the candidate, so, let's not take this too far. I think what it's really an indictment of is honestly not a lot having to do with him, but just the media's insatiable desire to celebrate and uplift this person. Remember the Jen Psaki interview from last week, the fluffiest of fluff interviews, with a former spokesperson for this same administration. So of course it's going to be that way. I mean, expecting that to be journalism is, another thing. But
that was the one where Psaki said he was recasting masculinity or something, right?
What is it? Look, there's some allegations of some scummy behavior in the past. I don't want to make too much of it because some of it is anonymous, some of it is long ago. I think the threshold for these kinds of accusations, now the accusation that he smacked an ex-girlfriend is pretty serious.
Really? Yeah.
But for all of these things, I have always taken the position that, okay, we should listen to people who come forward with Me Too-esque allegations. We should be respectful of them. We should not automatically dismiss them as women were dismissed, in the 80s and 90s and before, etc. That's not good. That doesn't mean every claim deserves automatic belief because people, not women specifically, but all people do lie or engage in deception or even without their own knowledge. We remember events in ways that are more favorable to us. So I always want to be very careful with these things. Now, obviously, the marital stuff is not even denied by him. People have trouble in their marriage, whatever. It's more about how he's been presented to us by the media that it seems a little bit at odds with reality.
So I have several different or contrasting views on this. I'm glad that you distinguished between the allegation that he hit his then girlfriend, this is a long time ago, and the other stuff, because the allegation about striking the ex-girlfriend is very troubling, and the Daily Mail gets sort of lampooned by people, including me, because it's tabloid and prone to that sort of stuff. But they had 3 people who said that the then girlfriend told them immediately or very shortly afterwards that Emhoff had hit her. That is, by its nature, a grave allegation. He didn't respond to comments from the Daily Mail. I believe the campaign did deny it elsewhere. That, to me, is a very different order of magnitude to some of the workplace stuff, which includes kind of people who used to work with him saying he was a bit of an asshole. And, I don't know what that supposedly gets us one way or another.
Yeah.
That's just not relevant or anything substantive.
And to be clear, that the slapping incident that has been corroborated by several different people, that would be enough to get you expelled from any college campus in America under policies that the Obama administration and the Biden administration forced on college campuses under Title IX. I've done a lot of reporting on that.
Hold on. I think it's fair enough to expel people for assaulting women, wouldn't you say?
Certainly after a procedure where it is.
Sorry. Okay.
No. I'm saying the mere accusation would be enough, even if it was years ago, even if there was no evidence of it. I mean, the procedure. Well, yes, of course, you should be expelled if you're. But these are not criminal proceedings. I've done a lot of reporting on them in the past. Often the accused is not entitled to an attorney. The standard of evidence is just more likely than not, rather than beyond a reasonable doubt. Oftentimes people are not even made aware of the charges against them. It could be an anonymous accusation from years ago, and you are done. You are screwed. And I don't think that was fair to people in those situations, because I believe in due process, and I believe in the presumption of innocence, and I think you're entitled to what the criminal justice system gets you in a proceeding that is designed to mimic that process. That was not how this was handled by Democratic administrations under guidance they gave to colleges regarding Title IX. I think that was all a mistake. And there was a little bit of a fervor in the kind of Me Too era to relitigate some real wrongs, some real dismissals, and some treating people who had accusations in a cruel way, which I think was absolutely wrong. But it went too far. And then this all went out the window the second Joe Biden got accusations. And then it was like, well, how much can we really say that about the Tara Reade one was a very serious accusation from a long time ago. Now, it did have some contemporary evidence at the time. She told a mother who told a radio. There was other people who had heard at the time. Now, I'm saying, look, we should listen to this woman, and you should treat her very seriously. And we've interviewed her on Rising. We talked about it. If I was inclined to vote for Joe Biden, would I change my mind based on something from 20 years ago that doesn't have a beyond a reasonable doubt kind of evidence to it? No, I think that's absolutely fair. But that was not the standard that was being preached at us by activists on this issue.
So I think there is a legitimate point for sure about double standards and the way they are used in the political arena. Donald Trump has numerous allegations of admittedly varying severity about inappropriate and sometimes assault against women. And he, like anyone, is entitled to the presumption of innocence. But Biden has the Tara Reid thing. Bill Clinton, I'm showing my age here, but I mean, there was a completely credible accusation of rape made against Bill Clinton. And that is something that is sort of dismissed or minimized by people who agree.
Juanita Broaddrick.
Yes, Juanita Broaddrick, exactly.
Yeah. And there was so much against Clinton, it kind of all gets lumped together under the Lewinsky stuff, which was, inappropriate workplace conduct, but was a I mean, you can argue it because he's the boss and it's not. But the Juanita Broaddrick accusation is full-on rape.
Right. No, absolutely. And it was minimized wrongly by people who liked Bill Clinton's politics. And I think that the right also does that with Trump and with other people when there are accusations of assault or impropriety or worse against them. So I think the point is there needs to be a universal standard about this stuff. And too often people, whatever side they're on, tend to do the yes, but thing if the allegation is made against someone on their side. And I wouldn't defend that at all.
Yeah, very much so. All right, we'll have more Rising right after this. People of Florida are no strangers to hurricanes, but Hurricane Milton is setting off alarm bells across government and even among local meteorologists. NBC weatherman in Miami, John Morales, teared up while reporting on Milton. Let's watch.
It's just an incredible, incredible, incredible hurricane. It has dropped 50 millibars in 10 hours. I apologize. This is just horrific. Maximum sustained winds are 160 miles per hour, and it is just gaining strength in the Gulf of Mexico, where you can imagine the winds, the seas are just so incredibly, incredibly hot.
Morales reshared his reporting on X, writing, quote, "I debated whether to share this. I did apologize on the air, but I invite you to read my introspection on the Atomic Bulletin of how extreme weather driven by global warming has changed me. Frankly, you should be shaken too, and demand climate action now."
Fox News meteorologist Noah Berggren wrote on X, quote, "This is nothing short of astronomical. I am at a loss for words to meteorologically describe to you the storm's small eye and intensity. 897 millibars pressure with 180 mph max sustained winds and gusts 200 plus miles per hour. This is now the fourth strongest hurricane ever recorded by pressure on this side of the world. Meteorologists are getting caught in the eye of the storm, whether or not these storms are caused by climate change."
Well, and there is, to be fair, something of a debate about this, the extent to which climate change is real. I certainly accept that it is happening and that we are contributing to it. The relationship between climate change and extreme weather is up for some debate.
And individual storms, did it cause this particular thing? Yeah.
Yes, because you always have to reckon with, and what they're going through in Florida right now and other places in the country is very frightening, and people have died, and it is scary, and resources, it sounds like, are not being made available to them by the federal response has been catastrophic, and that's all worthy of condemnation. At the same time, it's important. I'm someone who tends to avoid or be skeptical of everything's always getting worse narratives, because actually fewer people in general, in the U.S. at least, it's absolutely true, die in extreme weather events over time because we actually have better infrastructure to protect people from the consequences. Now, it is true that it'd be better if we have more renewable energy resources and we do more to protect the climate. I'm all for transitioning to those things in a time-appropriate manner, but we don't want to live in the Stone Ages again in order to do that, because more people die that way during the catastrophic weather events over human history that were not caused by man-made climate change, but just happened anyway because that stuff happens, and we had no way to defend ourselves because we didn't have the technological innovations that relied on these energy sources we've used.
Yeah, I mean, I take the point that the capacity to have better protections and better ways of reacting to these events has improved. But to me, that is like, that's the Band-Aid, right? You're then treating the problem after it has gone a long way down the tracks. Now, yes, you can debate, of course, whether this particular hurricane is caused by climate change or not. Hurricanes in and of themselves are not a new phenomenon,
no.
But it seems pretty clear that these extreme weather events are picking up in frequency. And as you say, the broad reality of climate change is something that is happening. And the pushback against that, often either just anti-science or driven on occasions by the fossil fuel industry, I think is wrong. Now, then you have, I think, a separate issue which does go to the sort of media question. I actually, those clips that we played, I think there was, they became kind of instantly controversial. I kind of feel like we're at a time where it is only those emotional moments that sometimes break through. And I can understand frustration on the part of people who do know what they're talking about on this stuff if they just feel that it has never been listened to, really.
Sure, and sometimes data points are, cherry-picked to scare people. Like I saw a report about how the economic damage wrought by extreme weather in recent years. And they said, but actually, if you look over the time frame, it's lowering how many dollars it spends to fix these things because, again, the technology gets better. Or we hear about, I saw this statistic the other day, the number of people in recent years who died from extreme heat because of the rising temperature. But of course, extreme cold kills more people than extreme heat. So you're not considering the lives saved on the other end, which is not to say we should, warm the entire globe or something, because then the people most affected are, in the southern hemisphere, the equator lying, which tend to be less developed nations. So I understand why those people might be reeling, but. And then broadly, there's the larger problem of even if we get our emissions and everything in line, well, China's not doing that. The major, massive, giant polluters who have no problem being reckless in terms of the whole planet, we have to have some agreement with them, or it's not. And what we do is not going to make much of a difference.
I know, and I don't really disagree with that, but I think the danger is that it leads to a sort of inaction on our part, either individually or nationally. So it becomes this argument that people take refuge in a way. Oh, well, like China's doing this, so it doesn't really matter what we do. It does matter what we do. These events are becoming worse. It is still a situation where the absolutely worst catastrophic outcome can still be avoided to some extent if things change. But if we just stay in this sort of framework of, oh, well, other countries will do whatever they do and it's all going to be a mess, then nothing happens, and then you can be in very catastrophic situations, including parts of the United States that are going to become increasingly uninhabitable because of the sheer heat.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think government should, especially to the extent they're, preventing people from making more responsible decisions. Do you know how hard it is, for instance, to put a solar panel on your own property in, at least in the District of Columbia? I imagine it's difficult other places.
Because of the amount of regulation around.
Yes, because of the amount of regulation. It's ridiculous. They make you, it's your own property. I think as a libertarian, you should be able to do what you want with it. So to the extent we can get government out of the way, I think that would be helpful. And then the bureaucracy that people in these hurricane zones are dealing with in terms of trying to get supplies out. Now we're hearing lots of different things, and it's hard to tell from our perches in Washington, D.C. what exactly is true, what is anecdotal, but there's a lot of frustration with how the last hurricane has been handled by FEMA, and which is nothing new. But it sounds like FEMA. I have a hard time believing they have an absence of money to deal with this, because they have a massive budget and we seem to find money for everything. Yeah. They're having staffing problems, I guess.
Yeah, I mean,
if you say so.
Let's just be careful about that. The whole thing about like, oh, you've money for Lebanon and not domestic disasters. Those are two separate funding streams.
Well, but it's all government money.
It is all government money, but I mean, you can't just go in and appropriate something that has been given for one purpose to another purpose. difference. Also, I want to get back to your solar panels and getting government out of the way. Aren't your solar panels in some sense subsidised by government or not?
Well, I don't want them subsidized. Yeah, no. I would no sub.
The government could act in your favour.
I don't want subsidies for. I don't want solar subsidies for green energy sources. I don't want subsidies for fossil fuel stuff. Anyway, there's. I haven't looked into this, but many proponents of green energy say, well, the unclean fuel supplies get favorable preferential policy treatment. I don't want any of that. I want it. I support green energy, but it has to win on its own in the marketplace, and when it does, that'll be great. I don't want, even though, my dear friend Elon Musk, I don't want subsidies for his cars either. They got to compete in the marketplace.
See, this is our fundamental difference. I think government should incentivize behaviour that is in favour of the greater good.
You want the nudge and the push.
Yes.
Don't push.
Encouraging people down the right course.
No, then I'm gonna do it. Then I'm gonna not do it to be defiant and difficult. We've got lots more coming up on Rising today. Stay tuned. Roya Hakakian was born and raised in a Jewish family in Tehran. When the 1979 Iranian Revolution started, anti-Semitism spread, and her family were granted political asylum in the U.S., ultimately settling in New York. She has written several books about Iran, including her critically acclaimed memoir called Journey from the Land of No.
She has thought deeply about her homeland and has written extensively on it. Her expertise on Iranian women is unparalleled. Now that Iran is capturing headlines for its intensifying battles with Israel, we thought we would turn to her to get her unique take. Today, she's public scholar at the Moynihan Center at City College in New York City. Welcome, Roya.
Thank you so much for having me on.
So let's just start in general terms. Can you paint a picture of where you see Iran right now? Obviously, there's a lot of tensions within the country as well as internationally. What's your general take on where the country stands right now?
Well, I think the clerics in Iran are hugely surprised and shocked. I think they have simply gotten used to the notion that they can carry out various attacks, whether through their proxies or through their various arms in Europe against Iranian dissidents and so on, and not really experience any retaliation in response. And the attacks that Israel has conducted against Iran, whether it was the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh in Iran a couple of months ago, to the getting rid of a couple of, or several, Iranian IRGC members in Syria, and then finally the assassination of Hassan Nasrallah has shocked Iran because Israel has given Iran the response that it hadn't expected. And I think while the nation on the inside is extremely terrified and worried about the future, at the same time, the impasse seems to be about to break, and perhaps they can hope for a different sort of future as a result of this confrontation.
Yeah, we've always, hoped that there will be some groundswell of opposition to the regime there. Of course, this gets into this difficult territory where, many authoritarian regimes around the world have gotten, more effective at staying in power, even versus very widespread popular discontentment. What is the sentiment among the people in Iran to have any hope toward moving toward a more democratic or modern society in accordance with what the people actually wish for?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think two facts are indisputable. One is that the reform movement in Iran began in 1997, and everyone around the world, including the Iranian diaspora and certainly the nation within, was incredibly hopeful that it can be the beginning of a major transformation in Iran. 26 years has passed since the start of the reform movement, and nothing has changed. That's fact number one. Fact number two is that the containment policy that the United States and the West have pursued with Iran has not only not worked, but really empowered Iran. The more the U.S. has tried to de-escalate and not respond to Iran, and the same goes for the West, the more powerful Iran seems to have become, whether it's through the propping up of Bashar Assad in Syria or, feeding and fueling the war in Lebanon through its proxies, Hezbollah, or Hamas and Yemen and all these other actors, Iran seems to have simply benefited from the notion of the containment policy. So one cannot help but wonder, can a real response, which Israel has shown in the past month or so, change this configuration and force Iran to either accept defeat and come to accept the idea that it needs to back off, or a further so-called escalation or response on behalf of Israel and the West will weaken the regime in Tehran and allow the internal movement, which we saw take place in 2022 in response to the killing of Mahsa Amini in September of 2022, rise up again and then do hopefully its magic and deliver a final knock and blow to the regime.
But
that's possible.
Yeah, but let me just push back on that a little, Roya, and that you're the expert in these matters. But isn't there a danger that if the goal or the objective that you would like to see is internal change within Iran, isn't there a danger that that would actually be put off or delayed if the nation at large felt under attack either from Israel or from the United States? Doesn't that risk actually fostering a sort of knee-jerk defense, not so much of the regime per se, but the regime as emblematic of a nation under attack from enemies?
Right. I would have entirely agreed with you if this were 1989 or 1990, when the regime in Iran was somewhat new. The revolution was in its 10th year. But this is 46 years later. And every time the internal population in Iran, the public, has risen up to demand a change, whether it was a student movement in 1999 or the several rising up of the women throughout the years, most recently in 2022, we have seen nothing but the regime responding with an iron fist, arresting, executing, and basically dispersing the protesters into the West and into exile. So I think what may have been true, that any sort of serious response would have galvanized the Iranians against forces from without. By this point, the people are simply looking to see some kind of change, some kind of force that will change this equation that is not going in any direction, to perhaps force the regime, whether it's through an uprising inside Iran or the pressure of the diaspora community, to transform in one way or another. A few years ago, when the Trump administration assassinated Qasem Soleimani, the head of the IRGC in Iran, we heard all over the place that Iranians would galvanize against the United States as a result of this. That didn't happen. And every time since then, we have heard this scenario be repeated. And it has not happened, partially because the regime has failed after 40 plus years to respond to the needs of the public in even the smallest way, including the fact that women demanded the eradication of the morality police. And even that small request has not been answered. So I would say no.
How can we, though, assuage concerns about a broader war now spilling out between Israel and Iran, one that will end up involving the U.S., as much as in an ideal world we would like to see certainly a more friendly, more tolerant, more modern regime in Iran. We don't want, global catastrophe in order to get there. That's not going to be acceptable to U.S. interests. So how does that, showing enough restraint while also being morally supportive, certainly of things improving in Iran without going to war with the country, which no one here is willing to do.
Right. And I don't think that anybody inside Iran wants the United States, Israel, or any foreign power to do the job of internal transformation. Again, I have to go back to my initial point. Containment hasn't worked. And we know from the history of the past 25 years that Iran has simply benefited and been empowered by being left alone. And its chief ally, Russia, has also been a beneficiary of the so-called containment policy. So what the West could potentially do at this moment is, if Israel is about to respond to Iran, allow some of the military targets to be attacked by Israel, perhaps the facilities that the missiles and the drones and the very many weaponry that Iran has been using, whether to supply the Russians or to attack Israel with, to be attacked and targeted. And perhaps that can deliver a message to Iran. It can weaken perhaps a sense of confidence that the regime has had, that no matter what it does, the West will not dare to respond. And then, let's think about a Yugoslavia scenario where, the NATO attacked Milosevic, and it took about a year and a half, but the internal movement started to bubble up and finally remove Milosevic from power. I would like to hope, although there is no guarantee, that this can happen within Iran. And the entire region can be freed of the clutch of Hezbollah, which has taken Syria, Lebanon into its grip and has turned both of them into failed states. And that could potentially be a major transformation, not just for Israel, but for the region at large.
Roya Hakakian, thank you so much for joining us today. Appreciate it.
Thank you for having me on.
It came as a surprise to many when Kamala Harris revealed in her debate with Donald Trump that she is a card-carrying gun owner. And it may also come as a surprise that her weapon of choice is a Glock. Let's listen to what she told 60 Minutes and the rest of America.
You recently surprised people when you said that you are a gun owner. And then if someone came into your house...
That was not the first time I've
they would
talked
get
about
shot.
it. That's not the first time I've talked about it.
So what kind of gun do you own, and when and why did you get it?
I have a Glock, and I've had it for quite some time. And look, Bill, my background is in law enforcement. And so there you go.
Have you ever fired it?
Yes. Of course I have. At a shooting range. Yes, of course I have.
Now, here's the fun part of the story. When Harris was a district attorney in San Francisco, she backed Proposition H, which would have banned all handguns in the city, including a Glock. But it didn't pass, and that was 19 years ago. She supported Washington, D.C.'s efforts to ban all handguns 2 years later. She's not stated exactly when she purchased her Glock. She kept it vague in the last few years. And many conservatives are calling this a hypocrisy while supporting, as I support, her right to own a gun, but I support everyone's right to own a gun. In the two cities she's lived in, San Francisco and Washington, D.C., she's supported efforts to ban the gun. She signed on to an amicus brief for the Heller case in D.C. that was about keeping in place a ban on all handguns, the exact kind of gun she owns. The Supreme Court recognized that right. She talks about being able to stop someone who breaks into your house with a gun. I agree with that. I think most Americans do think you should be able to defend your property. It was really weird when someone, I think it was Kirsten Welker, talked to John Fetterman and said, isn't that weird that she said that? And he responded, no. But is there hypocrisy here?
So I'm going to push back against the idea that there's hypocrisy, and this is why. I think it is legitimate to make personal decisions based upon what the overall situation is. So in this case, Kamala Harris could make the argument that those laws barring gun use were not passed. that, in her judgment, and in mine for that matter, fuels the widespread ownership of guns. Her further argument is that as someone who has been involved with law enforcement for a long time, she is a potential target, and therefore she bought a gun for her own protection. I don't think that is a hypocrisy. I think you can make the argument that I would rather the overall picture would be different, but so long as it's not, I am going to have a gun. That is separate, and we could get on to this in a second, that is separate from the fact that she now has become this sort of bragging about her gun type person, which I don't love, and I think is a kind of gun porn intended to appeal to people in the middle ground, and I think that's a bit dodgy in its political expedience, but I don't think it is the actual stance is hypocritical.
No, I don't agree with that. I think I think it is an appeal to Second Amendment, not even just enthusiasts, but gun owners, which is a lot of Americans. A lot of Americans are responsible, legal gun owners, and I mean, this gets into a broader discussion of gun control. I mean, the Heller case, the D.C. case, was about, it has been at various times, Washington, D.C., a profoundly unsafe city with a lot of shootings. The plaintiffs in that case wanted to protect themselves, said they had the right in a city with tons of gun violence to protect themselves, and if you have a ban on handguns, then law-abiding people who use guns responsibly will not have access to firearms, and people at the margins of society who are dangerous or who are criminal or are engaged in criminal activities, they will still have guns because there are tons of illegal weapons on our streets. You can't if we could, wave a magic wand and get rid of all of them, that would be a different thing, but we don't live in that fantasy land. We live in a land where...
You still wouldn't do it, though, if we could, right? In that fantasy land, you still wouldn't do it, I don't think.
No, I wouldn't do it. But it would make more sense.
But if we did do it, we would save thousands and thousands of lives, is my point, in that hypothetical.
I mean,
if you could ban them, you should.
Yeah, and if we had prevented the printing press from ever existing, we would have avoided hundreds of years of religious warfare in Europe. But we have to, we can't fight. You can't put Pandora back in the box. But we especially can't, in my view, prohibit bans on guns now. Gun control is just restrictions on lawful gun owners because people can get illegal weapons, and you're going to have. In fact, most of the crimes in this city are committed by people who already, under existing gun laws, are not allowed to have a weapon. Doesn't stop them. So if you just expand those laws, what you end up doing is disarming people who I believe should have every right to own a weapon and to carry it for protection, and do use them for protection in some cases.
But the whole problem that we come back to here, Robbie, is that the United States has so many more weapons than other developed nations and so many more gun deaths than other developed nations. And to suggest that there is no connection between those two things.
Oh, I don't suggest. No, I think there is a connection. No, it's fair. No, I'm not suggesting that at all. It is very clear that we have more. That I don't think we have more proclivity toward violence, but the easy access to guns. Where it really makes a difference, frankly, is in suicides.
Yes,
we have more suicides because people succeed at committing suicide because of the easy access to firearms. Now, I am even less inclined to limit other people's access to firearms for their self-protection because of suicides, to be honest. That's just a philosophical standpoint. I don't think suicide is good. I don't want people to commit suicide, but I think you have that right, and I'm certainly not going to disarm someone else because if you, the argument for doing it because other people are being harmed, but you harming yourself with a weapon is not a good argument for someone else to no longer be able to carry a weapon. So you harming other people or the public or going on some spree, I can see why that's an argument. Again, I still would not do that. But that's a better argument than if most of it is concentrated in the category of people harming themselves. I mean, that is very sad. What can we do to have better mental health care or whatever it will take? But I would not disarm other people on that basis.
So this is by its nature a rather bleak area to get into, but since we're in it, let's keep going. I think there is an argument to be made on the suicide question. There's a very good magazine article several years ago now in Rolling Stone by a guy called Stephen Roderick about the high rates of male suicide, particularly in the Mountain West and other areas like that. And certainly there were advocates within that piece who were arguing that one of the things about gun ownership and suicide is not simply that people succeed in killing themselves, but that people can make a snap judgment in a moment of despair or domestic strife or whatever, and it actually results in suicides that would not otherwise take place. Now, where I would certainly give some leeway to your argument is, can that be prevented by restrictions of gun ownership? Most of those people had those guns legally, probably, and they ended up harming themselves. My issue overall is just, I think that the laxity of the gun laws encourages a massive circulation of firearms in the population, which then has a whole lot of knock-on effects on suicide, on crime, on the way that the police go into any situation with the knowledge that someone may be armed and therefore become, in my view, too trigger happy themselves. And there are all these knock-on effects from just a country that is swamped with firearms.
Yeah, look, I think having stricter gun control laws, I will be perfectly honest, I think it would reduce the suicide rate. I don't think it would reduce the homicide rate because all of the I want to be careful about using the word all, but so many of the homicides are perpetrated by people who already should be restricted under existing law. So then it's like, well, these things aren't being enforced enough, and then we get into a territory where then liberals are going to start to get uncomfortable. Well, police are going to go door to door, disarming people or having very intrusive searches on the population disproportionately likely to be engaged in criminal activity, which is lower income and minority people. That's going to raise all sorts of police racism questions. No one is going to want to do that. We won't have the stomach for it when it comes to it. And I think that's also important to remember.
I think the solution is just repeal the Second Amendment, Robbie. That would be much better off.
All right, we'll get rid of the Senate and the Electoral College, and we'll just have all our sacred institutions gone. More Rising right after this.
Tim Walz is breaking from the Harris campaign and calling for the Electoral College to be abolished. The Minnesota governor made the comments Tuesday night at a fundraiser hosted at California Governor Gavin Newsom's home in Sacramento, saying, quote, "The Electoral College needs to go. We need a national popular vote. But that's not the world we live in." The Harris camp swiftly clarified its stance, stating that getting rid of the Electoral College is not a position the campaign supports.
Republicans and Trump officials rapidly adopted those comments in their messaging. They accused Walz of trying to rig the election. Trump's campaign writing on X, "Why does Tampon Tim hate the Constitution so much? He hates the First Amendment, he hates the Supreme Court, he hates the Electoral College. He sure loves communist China." What did you make of his Electoral College comments, Niall?
So one of the things I'm interested in is how this discussion is going to go, because to the best of my knowledge, there isn't a conservative or indeed libertarian and liberal position really on the Electoral College. I find it increasingly hard to defend the Electoral College for the office of presidency. I just think, I know the argument, as I understand it, is it sort of helps out smaller states, and it means that the campaign isn't focused in New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, and a few other places. But we're electing someone to lead the nation. The logical way to do that seems to be to have a national vote, to me. I'm not sure that the reasons for defending the Electoral College really continue to be as salient as they perhaps did in the initial era of the nation.
I mean, I think the pushback is more just about how the parties frame themselves. Democrats saying that Trump is this existential threat to democracy and to our profound institutions. Meanwhile, progressive Democrats, and apparently the VP candidate, wants to abolish many of those institutions, fundamentally reform them. Add seats or abolish the Supreme Court. Senate done differently. Electoral College done differently. As a libertarian, is there something specific about the Electoral College that's appealing? No, not really. You could have a different system. But here's the thing, you can't just complain, the system is, we can't win under this system, which is what Democrats seem to be saying about the Electoral College. I mean, if the system was different, Republicans would run different campaigns, right? You can't say if we just had a national popular vote, we need to do that because we would win that way. Well, anyway, that would be a bad argument because the system shouldn't be designed in a way favorable to you. But Republican presidential candidates don't campaign in California.
Yeah.
There are millions of Republicans who live there whose votes don't matter at all because there's tons of Republicans there, but that state is off limit because there's more Democrats. It's not Republicans' fault that Democrats have chosen to concentrate themselves disproportionately in cities on the coast, thereby giving over time more of an advantage to Republicans who are a little bit more dispersed throughout the states that have both heavy populations and a somewhat more even split in terms of the partisan affiliations like Michigan and Pennsylvania. That's a matter of geography. There's not cheating how that worked out. And, you know, Democrats could address it by moving elsewhere, but under a different system, you would just run different campaigns.
No, I take that point. I think you would run different campaigns, and I think they would be different in a lot of ways, and the geographical focus of them would be different. I just think a couple of things. One, yeah, I take your point. Sometimes people who make an argument for election reform of one kind or another are trying to help their party. That's not the argument that I'm making. I'm not even sure, to be fair, it's the argument that Walz is making. It's the idea that, you know, in 2020, Joe Biden won by the popular vote by about 7 million votes. It was very narrow in the battleground states. Right. So would that have been different in a national vote? Yes, probably. But right now we're having this campaign that we're all fixated on, lots of our viewers are fixated on, and really the number of voters who matter is tiny, because it is the people who might go one way or another in 7 states. And to your argument about California, for example, I think it would be good for California and for the country if those conservative voters in more rural areas of California did believe that their votes were more important and more relevant to the outcome. And sure, then Donald Trump or J.D. Vance or whomever would go to Orange County, would go to the more farmland in California and campaign. That's fine. I think that's perfectly legitimate.
Look, I don't think it necessarily benefits federal policy that Pennsylvania and actually that like Ohio and Iowa, I mean, in terms of the nominating procedure, farm subsidies have a disproportionate power over our electoral process because of their prominence that I don't think is necessarily good. The argument for the Electoral College, right, is that the states need to have a say. You know, California needs a say, Texas needs a say. That's gotten a little bit outmoded by the fact that the federal government is just so much now more powerful than state governments, and so much policy that the creators of our institutions, that our founders intended to be left to the states, is now in fact done at the federal level. That's not something I'm thrilled about. You know, it gets tricky because sometimes the federal government is a better defender of individual liberty than the state government. Sometimes the state government is a better defender of individual liberty than the federal government. That's what I care about, is individual liberty, and I want to strengthen those protections. I'm not really sure that one system or the other is better for that.
Well, don't you think, though, a national popular vote would more evenly spread the importance of individual voters to the overall system? It would empower a greater number of people, would it not?
Yeah. At the end of the day, I'm just semi-indifferent to the process because
you just don't care.
Well, what I care about is limiting the powers of the government.
Yeah.
How we pick the people that run it has only a tangential relationship to that. I mean, it matters in some cases. I want the legislature, for instance, I want Congress to have more input over foreign policy. Right now, the president, the executive branch, is totally unconstrained in charge of foreign policy, which leads to reckless spending and reckless intervention. So I want Congress to have more power. I mean, I just want it back the way it was. Congress was supposed to be the principal rule-making, law-making body, and the president was supposed to just carry out the will of Congress. We've totally subverted or inverted that over time. I want Congress to have more oversight over the vast federal bureaucracy. I want rulemaking, policymaking done by the elected members of the legislatures rather than the permanent bureaucracy. But that has less to do with how you actually elect the people who do it. I could see an argument. I wouldn't stand it. I'm not gonna. I couldn't work myself into a fervor. I couldn't do a radar being like, no, they're taking the Electoral College. How dare they? They have to pry it from my cold, dead hands. No, but also, do I think it's important to change it? No.
I just think that the current system disempowers a very large number of people, particularly people whose own views differ significantly from the overall complexion of their states.
Yeah.
So essentially, conservatives in Vermont and liberals in Utah end up with no voice or relevance at the national level at all. Yeah. And I think it would be good for us all if we changed that.
I think it would be good if the national level, the voice was a little bit more muted.
Wow.
And we just let Vermonters do what Vermonters, is that what we call them?
Something like that.
Vermonters. Vermonters do what what they want, and Montanans do what they want, and Michiganders do what they want, and we just let each other live and let live, and that's more along my way of thinking.
Just unraveling the national fabric.
Let's unravel it. Let's start picking at that thread, pulling it apart, and see what we have left. Maybe not much. Maybe that will be better. Well, we've had some pretty philosophical debates today on Rising, everything from gun control to the very fabric of the U.S.'s DNA. Tell us what you think. That does it for us today on the show. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss any content. And for those of you who like to listen while on the go, we're now available anywhere that you can find podcasts. See you later.